Alright, this is the Elder's Quest timeline. And this timeline is a bit annoying in a couple of places, but a lot of it lines up pretty nicely. So first, just to explain some premises, in order for me to help visualize how everything lines up, I like to put things on a bit of a calendar. So let's say hypothetically, in this universe, a month is 28 days, just to keep things even. So every quarter moon or a week is 7 days. The first of the month I deem as the gathering, just to keep things a bit simple, which means a quarter moon later is the half moon meeting, and the quarter moon before a gathering is the second half moon meeting of the month. And just to show this is a moon cycle. The full moon here would be the gathering. Half moon later is the new moon, but that's not the half moon meeting with the medicine cats. The main reason why is because numerous times when they are at the moon pool, they mention how the moon shines onto the water. But that can't happen if the half moon meeting is during the new moon when there is no moonlight. So it must be the first and third quarter phases. And this would make sense because to the cats, this looks like a half moon. Also, Moonpaw is mentioned to have been named after a half moon, and her face is split down the middle with two different colors. So that kind of also just confirms that cats would look at the quarter moons here and say that those are the half moons. Now, in the real world, a moon cycle is roughly-ish about a month, and therefore every quarter moon is roughly-ish about a week. So just to keep things a bit simple, we're going to consider a quarter moon to be exactly a week, which also makes perfect sense because for them, a month's worth would be one moon. So therefore, whenever they do say quarter moon, they must mean a week's worth for us. Now, we don't know what a week's worth is in their world, but just to help me visualize, I put it as 7 days. I don't think this is necessarily accurate, and there is one point in time in this timeline where that kind of does matter, but there's not much I can do with that because we don't actually know how long a week's worth is. So just to keep things simple, the first chapter of the book will start during month 1, which means that the first gathering, which happens after the first chapter, will be month 2. Alright, so now onto the timeline. Thankfully, because of this, we do get some anchor points where we do know specifically when certain events do happen. And in this book, we get 4 of them. We get 2 gatherings and 2 half moon meetings. So just to go in order, the first one is the first gathering. And we know that the chapter takes place on the day of the gathering because it mentions here, Leaf Star sighed. I don't know. I'll tell Frecklewish and Fidget Flake what I saw, and I'll bring it up to the other clans at tonight's gathering. So this will be month 2, day 1. Next, we have the first half moon meeting, and that's Moonpaw's chapter 9. And we know that this is a half moon meeting because right down here, Jay Feather, are you ready? Outerheart poked his head around the bramble screen into the den. It's time we were leaving for the moon pool. So this would be month 2, day 8. Now, technically, we don't know yet if this is the first or the second half moon meeting of the month, but since there is a second half moon meeting before a gathering, I think it's safe to say that chapter 9 would be the first half moon meeting. So the second half moon meeting of the month is Moonpaw's chapter 12. Oddly enough, this is the next chapter we have with Moonpaw. Yes, they did back-to-back Moonpaw chapters with the half moon meeting, and the beginning plays out almost identically the same. Have you finished, Jay Feather? Outerheart asked. It's nearly time to leave for the half moon meeting. And so this one will be month 2, day 22. And then we have the second gathering of the book. So for part of this chapter, it takes place at the gathering, and the rest is prior. But it's not over, Hawkwing reminded her as she turned away. SkyClan has voted to depose you, but as I recall, all the other leaders have to agree too, at the gathering tonight. So there's our 4 anchor points. Roughly speaking, the rest of the chapters I can base around these. So, just to start with the first gathering, Moonpaw's chapter 6. This one's an easy one. It says right in the first paragraph, she hardly felt as though a couple of heartbeats had passed since she had crawled into her nest after the gathering, and yet it was already morning, so this is the next morning. Now, chapter 7. This is where things start to get a little weird. I believe that Tawnypelt's chapter 7 happens about 2 days later. It could be argued that it happens a little later, but I believe it is 2 days. So right off the bat, it says the sun had not yet appeared. So it is still very early morning, hardly even dawn, if that. And then right here it says Tawnypelt padded along the shore toward the place where SkyClan's stream spilled out into the lake, where she would meet the rest of the patrol. So this is when they go on patrol. The patrol that was mentioned at the gathering in chapter 5, right over here. Because it happened in the morning, and because during the gathering they did not establish where they would meet up, you need at least one day prior to the patrol going out to establish where you're going to meet. So the leaders would have had to send out a messenger to establish this. And because chapter 7 starts early in the morning, before the sun even rose, this had to have happened the day before. So there is at least one day in between the gathering and this chapter. Now the first reason why I think that this chapter would happen 2 days after and not anymore is because Tawnypelt, Crowfeather, and Leafstar are all very adamant on wanting to check things out. They're all very worried. And Tawnypelt specifically, since 1, this is her chapter, and 2, it was Tigerstar, her leader, who had suggested the patrol. She would definitely make sure that it happens sooner rather than later. We've seen from her perspective already that she is very concerned and wants to take action. So I have no reason to believe that she would wait any longer. And on top of that, it says right here at the bottom, when they are done the patrol, maybe we should patrol here every quarter moon just to keep an eye on things. So presumably a quarter moon later, they would do another patrol. Now, since the first half moon meeting would happen a quarter moon after the gathering, that means that in theory, if they do another patrol, it would be soon after the half moon meeting. And that's exactly what happens. We have the half moon meeting here in chapter 9, and then chapter 10 is when the patrol happens. Now, this chapter actually happens the day after the half moon meeting, and there's a potential timeline mistake because of that, but I'll get to that in a moment. So first, we have to look at Leafstar's chapter 11. So we know that this happens the day after the half moon meeting because right down here, it says, dawn light was seeping into the sky. Frecklewish and Fidgetflake had returned from the half moon meeting, ready to end the vigil. So since 2 medicine cats just got back from the half moon meeting, this must be the morning after. Now, part of chapter 10 happens the same day because a little later, Hawkwing, Leafstar beckoned her deputy to her. I have to go, presumably on the patrol, but you can't. You would never be back by sun high, and you have to be here for the vote. I'll find another cat to go in your place. Which then, slightly later, it says, Hawkwing nodded, and as Leafstar turned away, she heard him calling for Pale Sky. And Pale Sky was on the patrol. He had hardly finished speaking when the undergrowth parted and a cat emerged. A young black and white she-cat Tawnypelt had seen once or twice at meetings, which it was Pale Sky. And that's what the rest of the chapter is about. Now, I did split up chapter 10 into 2 separate parts, part 1 and part 2, because they do happen on 2 different days, so it's just easier to do that. So the second part of chapter 10 happens on the same day as chapter 11, because again, in chapter 11, Pale Sky is sent to the patrol, and in chapter 10, the patrol with Pale Sky happens. This means that part 2 of chapter 10 happens the day after the half moon meeting. So now that we have established this timeline, that happens about 1 quarter moon after the first patrol happens. If the first patrol happened any later, then I feel like it's a little weird that chapter 10 would have happened so soon after the first patrol, especially if our weeks are less than 7 days. Because what we're looking at here is day 1 is the gathering. I'm speculating that day 3 was the first patrol, and day 9 is the second patrol. That's only 6 days apart. Now, there is a bit of a potential of a mistake here with chapter 10 and its timeline, because right down here it says, at the half moon meeting, the medicine cats had seen more evidence of two-leg activity at the moon pool. The clan leaders had decided that the patrol that had investigated the two-leg building outside the Sky Clan border should go out again. Which, first off, that statement's a bit weird because the patrol already established that they should do this every quarter moon. I guess this is just the leaders basically confirming, yeah, that makes sense, and especially after what the medicine cats had seen. Now, the problem here is that right at the beginning of the chapter, it says that the moon was still up, casting dark shadows across the forest floor. So it's hardly even dawn. Furthermore, in chapter 11, when the medicine cats get back, dawn light is seeping into the sky. So Frecklewish and Fidgetflake gets back like pretty much when dawn is appearing. Note as well that Tawnypelt is already walking to the meeting place. She's already left Shadow Clan's camp, and the sun is not coming up yet. Or I guess at least the next paragraph says the first hint of dawn was creeping into the sky. So like it's just starting. When she would have left Shadow Clan camp, it wouldn't have yet. And according to the map, the moon pool is way over here. Sky Clan camp is here, with Shadow Clan camp even further away. It's like twice the distance. So in reality, the Shadow Clan medicine cats should have gotten back even later. But let's say all the medicine cats somehow miraculously get back to camp at the exact same time. Well, it's still dawn. How did the leaders, all of them, already come to the conclusion we need to send them out and let's give them permission to look at the moon pool? It doesn't say that Tiger Star had decided. It says the clan leaders had decided. How did that happen already? If this is the very, very early dawn after the half moon meeting. Okay, so maybe the Sky Clan medicine cats just happened to get back to the camp really late for some reason, but the other ones already got there. Well, it's actually kind of normal for the medicine cats to get back at dawn. So here, after Jayfeather and Outerheart had already left for the moon pool, it says, Moonpaw felt as though only heartbeats had passed and she fell asleep. But dawn light was filtering into the den past the brambles. And then Outerheart and Jayfeather emerged from the tunnel, back from the half moon meeting. So they too had also arrived around dawn. I mean, it's hard to tell from the map, but they're probably about the same distance from the moon pool as Sky Clan. So, and I believe it was also dawn when they got back in this one too. The moon was close to setting as Moonpaw, her fur almost dry, followed Jayfeather and Outerheart back into the Thunder Clan camp. So that's probably a little bit before dawn. Certainly not enough time for the leaders to call the second patrol together. And in this particular chapter, the three of them probably went back to the Thunder Clan camp a little earlier than usual, or at least faster than usual, since Moonpaw's incident of falling into the water. So I don't think chapter 10 could have happened the morning after the half moon meeting. But chapter 11 definitely does happen. Because again, chapter 11 explicitly states that the two medicine cats just got back from the meeting. So just to finish chapter 10 off, so the first part of chapter 10 happens the day before the second part. And that's simply shown here. Tawnypelt retraced the path she had taken with Birchfeather the day before. And this whole part of the chapter is about Birchfeather leaving to go to Sky Clan and Tawnypelt goes with him. So that happens the day before. And then Leaf Star's chapter 8. This also happens the day before Leaf Star's chapter 11. So the first part of chapter 10 and chapter 8 happens the same day. This is because this is the chapter where Kite Scratch dies, and chapter 11, they're finishing up his vigil. The vigil would have happened that night that Kite Scratch died. Therefore, chapter 8 happens the day before chapter 11. And now Leaf Star's chapter 14. There's not that much to go off of for this. The best that we get is, it says here, several days had passed since Reedclaw had led the attempt to remove Leaf Star from the leadership of her clan, which is like the whole premise of chapter 11. So chapter 14 happened several days after chapter 11. Now, several, unfortunately, is incredibly ambiguous. In these books, I'm pretty sure it's used several as in like 4 before, but it could be up to like 7 days. And it's really hard to point a range of numbers on. And this is where the issue with my week lengths come into play. Let's say it is 7 days here. Chapter 11 happens on day 9, the day after the half moon meeting. Several days later, let's just say, for example, that's 7. So now we're on the 16th. During this chapter, 3 more days pass. So now we're on the 19th. And at the end of this chapter, Leaf Star is kind of stuck in the medicine cat den for a bit, going in and out of unconsciousness, presumably. She doesn't get out of the medicine cat den until the next gathering, so for over another week, which that is definitely possible. Now, I don't think several would be meaning any longer here. In fact, I actually think it's meaning a bit shorter, unless the weeks are not 7 days long. It's more like 4 days long or something. And the reason is because the whole first part of this chapter is Tree coming up to Leaf Star and wanting to talk to her about the situation with Reedclaw. And it says here that Hawkwing sent him. Now, why would Hawkwing and Tree wait a long time to go and talk to her? In the scenario that several means 7 days, why would they wait a whole 7 days? I mean, maybe. The thing is, the longer this stretches out, the harder it is to believe that that happened. It's easier to believe that it's happened after more of like a few days. The problem is I also can't assume that several is more than a few, because again, I'm pretty sure there were other books in this world that use several as in 4. This one's a confusing one, and this is a bit difficult to explain. So Leaf Star's chapter 2, I claim, is 2 days before chapter 5, which is 2 days before the gathering. So first, all the way down here at the bottom, it says, then an idea flickered into Leafstar's mind. She would go alone to the moon pool and see if she could connect to Echo Song. Then, near the beginning of chapter 5, she wakes up and it states, she felt old and all her muscles ached from her disappointing trek to the moon pool the day before. So, she went to the moon pool the day before the gathering. Chapter 2 does not say that she goes to the moon pool that night. She went to the moon pool after chapter 2. It could have been that night, it could have been the next night, it could have been multiple nights later, but knowing Leafstar, I don't know why she would wait very long. Especially because in the last paragraph, right after she thinks about that, it says a tiny spark of hope and optimism woke inside Leafstar. She wouldn't wait multiple days if she could help it. However, it could not have happened the same day. So it had to have happened in the future. The reason why it couldn't have happened this same day is because right up here, it says, you're right, Tree, Leafstar agreed. Will you go to ShadowClan, please, and take Rootspring with you? So Tree goes to ShadowClan. Then in chapter 4, Cloverfoot and Tigerstar are talking, and it says, well done stopping them, Tigerstar grunted. This is all because of the message that Tree brought us the other day. Not yesterday, but the other day. So that means that chapter 4 had to have happened at least 2 days after chapter 2. So let's think about this for a moment. If Leafstar went to the moon pool the same day as this chapter, that means that the next day is chapter 5, the gathering. But for chapter 4 to have been in between these, if chapter 4 was the same day as the gathering, then yesterday Tree showed up. But because Tigerstar mentions that he showed up the other day, that leads me to believe that there was at least 1 day in between. So chapter 2 could not have happened the day before chapter 5. Okay, so what if chapter 4 actually happens after chapter 5? Well, chapter 4 is where we establish that Tawnypelt has a concern with what the Two Legs are doing outside of SkyClan's territory. And she brings this to Tigerstar's attention, and this is what the gathering in chapter 5 is about. But if chapter 4 happens after the gathering, then the conversation between Tawnypelt and Tigerstar was pointless, because Tigerstar already suggested doing a patrol. So that conversation must have happened before the gathering, and thus this chapter as well. So now, if chapter 2 was 2 days before the gathering, then this means that Tree goes to ShadowClan on the same day as chapter 2. Then, Leafstar does not go to the moon pool that night. She waits until the next night to go to the moon pool. And then the following night is the gathering. So this would put chapter 4 to be the same day as the gathering. So both these two chapters are 2 days after chapter 2 in this scenario. Because again, Tree visited the other day, not yesterday. Now, if chapter 2 is more than 2 days later, then that just means that Leafstar would have had to wait more than 1 day before going to the moon pool. The only way that that would have happened was if something comes up that Leafstar would have had to address first instead of going to the moon pool, which technically could happen, but I feel like that's a bit unlikely. So that's why I'm placing this at 2 days later. I hope that makes sense because it was really difficult to write that in a way that made sense, especially since I was kind of confused the whole time I was coming up with this too. Alright, so next we have chapter 1 and chapter 3. These two chapters we can't really place on a timeline too much outside of that Tawnypelt's chapter 1 chronologically would have come before Tawnypelt's chapter 4, and Moonpaw's chapter 3 would have come before Moonpaw's chapter 6. We also know as well that chapter 3 would have had to have happened before the gathering because Moonpaw is made an apprentice within this chapter. And in chapter 6, Sunbeam also says, it would explain why you aren't taking to your warrior training as quickly as some apprentices. If chapter 3 here happened the same day as the gathering, then there would have been no time for Sunbeam to have come to this conclusion. So this would have had to happen prior. Tawnypelt's chapter 13. This happens the morning after the second half moon meeting. And we know this because Puddleshine is referencing what happened to Moonpaw at the moon pool. And it says here, the two medicine cats had returned to the ShadowClan camp, and after they had reported to Tigerstar about the half moon meeting, they had headed for the fresh kill pile. They got back from the half moon meeting. This happens the next morning. Easy as that. Moonpaw's chapter 15 is very much the same. We heard you went to the moon pool last night. Golden Paw meowed as he skidded to a halt beside Moonpaw. So So this must have happened the morning after the half moon meeting as well. Okay, so Moonpaw is chapter 18. We don't know too much about when this would have happened outside of right here at the very beginning. It says that several days had passed since the loss and discovery of Sun Kit, which was the whole premise of chapter 15 pretty much. So at the end of chapter 18 here, Moonpaw asks Sunbeam if she can be her apprentice again. And then Sunbeam says, then I'll see you out here at dawn tomorrow. We'll start with some hunting practice. Then in chapter 20, right at the beginning, it says, Moonpaw made sure that her pelt was groomed perfectly before she left the medicine cat's den the following morning. Plus, the rest of this chapter is about her first day back on training. So chapter 20 must have happened the day after chapter 18. And finally here, chapter 22. Now in chapter 20, Moonpaw catches a rabbit, and that rabbit is referenced here. You don't need to do that by yourself, Shinepaw continued. You've surely earned some time to relax. That delicious rabbit we all shared was thanks to you. So this would have had to have happened later the same day because they shared the rabbit, and now Moonpaw is cleaning out the Elder's den, and Shinepaw says that you don't need to do that by yourself, and you've earned some time to relax. If this was the next day, that comment just wouldn't have made nearly as much sense. Unless Moonpaw caught another rabbit the next day that is just not mentioned, but this just very strongly implies that it's the same day as chapter 20. I will talk about the placement of these three in just a little bit. So now Tawnypelt. Chapter 16 has even less to go off of than chapter 18 over here. We have no idea where this is in the timeline. But chapter 19 happens the morning after chapter 16. At the end of this chapter, it says, padding over to the warrior's den, hoping for a brief nap before she went on duty, Tawnypelt wondered blah blah blah. So Tawnypelt goes over to the warrior's den and takes a nap before her night guard duty. Then in chapter 19, she's reflecting on guarding the camp at night and how there's like no cats and whatever to talk to and it's boring. And she also thinks back on what got her here with helping out Birchfeather. This just makes perfect sense that she would be thinking about this stuff on her first night guard duty. Why would she wait until the second night to then be thinking, it's been a long time since I've done this? Then at the end of this chapter, her and Birchfeather goes to a two-leg den to check it out, and she basically dies. So then in chapter 21, this happens the same day, because when she wakes up, she's in SkyClan's camp. And Frecklewish says, you weren't breathing and they thought you were dead, but they brought you back here. We had to pounce on your chest several times. I guess you might have some bruised ribs. Then up here, it says, Tawnypelt became aware of a pressure on her chest and a burning sensation in her lungs. Just a little bit later, it says, in the same instant, she felt herself taking a huge gulp of air and opened her eyes to see Fidgetflake and Frecklewish gazing down at her with concern in their eyes. That was describing how the medicine cats were pouncing on her chest. And then she woke up taking that huge gulp of air. She's been resuscitated now. If this happened the next day, she would have been dead. She would have died from not breathing. Now, that being said, I have no idea how Birchfeather, Hawkwing, and Violet Shine managed to get her back there without dying, since she wasn't breathing, but that's besides the point. Alright, so now, the placement for all of these chapters. I've been very confused on where to place this gathering, but I believe it happened after Moonpaw's chapters and before Tawnypelt's chapters. Now, first off, this would be the first time in this book that the chapters does not seem to follow a chronological order. So I was very confused about all this because there's issues with every single scenario. So I broke it down to every scenario for the gathering around Moonpaw's chapters and the gathering around Tawnypelt's chapters and put it all together. So let's say the gathering happened before Moonpaw's last three chapters. So chapter 15 would have still have happened before the gathering. The problem here is that regardless if Moonpaw was at the gathering or not, it's just a little bit weird that nothing was ever mentioned. If these chapters is of her becoming a warrior apprentice again. So if the gathering happened before these chapters, and if she was at the gathering, that would be really weird for her, because then she's there as a medicine cat apprentice. She would probably feel a bit weird. And I just find it a little strange that that wouldn't have been significant enough to have mentioned. Even if she wasn't at the gathering, I feel like that would still be a bit weird for her, because the idea of her not being there was because she's not sure yet of what she's doing or something like that. Regardless of the reasoning why she wouldn't be there, it just seems a bit strange to me that absolutely nothing would have been mentioned. But I mean, that's a very minor thing. I could see an argument for this happening. The only thing I could come up with that would place this after the gathering was that several days passed by. However, Jay Feather down here seems to be getting a bit impatient or grumpy with her or whatever, and says, then it's time for you to get back to work. This is in direct relation to Moonpaw being really weirded out by the whole Sun Kit thing, and he probably probably wouldn't have waited so many days to say this to her. He's a very straight to the point kind of character, so I can't imagine that he would have waited very long. So looking at the calendar, and again, I know these weeks may not be 7 days long, but chapter 15 happens on the 23rd. How many days do we think that Jay Feather would have waited to get impatient enough to tell Moonpaw to get back to work? Probably not many. So that's just like another reason why I don't think the gathering would have happened beforehand. This just kind of spreads these two chapters out a little too much, I feel. Scenario number 2, that the gathering actually happens during this time, either on the same day as chapter 18 or the same day as chapter 20. Now, I guess at that point, if it happened the same day as chapter 20, it also would have happened the same day as chapter 22, since these two happen on the same day. Regardless, I don't think this is the case because it's even weirder to me that the gathering would not have been mentioned at all if it was literally happening during this time, especially because this is the chapter that Leafstar steps down as leader. However, Moonpaw would not have had the weirdness of potentially going to the gathering while being a medicine cat, so that's a plus for it. And the timing between these two chapters and Jay Feather's impatience makes a little more sense. However, the third scenario is that the gathering happens after the Moonpaw chapters, and I couldn't think of a reason why this couldn't have happened. And for the pros, the reasons for this to have happened, these two chapters on the timeline would be able to be close enough where it does make more sense with the whole Jay Feather thing. And then we don't have any weirdness with the gathering not being mentioned during these chapters. So I think the gathering happened after Moonpaw's final 3 chapters. Now, for Tawnypelt. Let's say the gathering happens after these Tawnypelt chapters. Well, then that means that Tawnypelt and Leafstar are in the Medicine Cat Den at the same time. And while that could be true, because Tawnypelt may not have noticed Leafstar there, Leafstar definitely would have. And it's not mentioned at all or referenced that Tawnypelt is there. And then also, just thinking about how book 2 would start up, like, I just don't think that would flow very well. Because if we pick up where Tawnypelt left off, Leafstar had yet to step down. So you would have a potential discrepancy there, or just in general weirdness. Now, a pro is that the gathering wouldn't have been discussed yet. Now, the only pro to the gathering happening afterwards is because, similar to the Moonpaw stuff, with that it's weird that the gathering was never mentioned. If the gathering happens after, then it makes sense that nothing was referenced about the gathering in these chapters. Because in this scenario, for example, where the gathering actually happens during these chapters, the idea would be that the gathering would have likely happened the same night as chapter 16 and into the morning of chapter 19. But now, that just doesn't make any sense to me because Tawnypelt was on night guard duty during that time. Okay, so she's not at the gathering, but it's never once referenced that she's there in camp almost alone, with just a handful of cats around. And she also mentions that it's boring, nothing interesting going on in camp, and in the present state of peace. The thing with this is, if the gathering happened the same night, she likely would have heard about the whole Leafstar situation by now. That's interesting, but she says nothing interesting is going on. So I can't see the gathering happening at this time. And it couldn't have happened the same day as chapter 21 for the exact same reason as it happening after. Now, the final situation also has a tad bit of weirdness to it, with the gathering being before. The main thing with this is that no cat is talking about what happened at the gathering, not even Birchfeather. So in chapter 19, Tawnypelt meets up with Birchfeather, and he's doing one of his 3 trials. Now, if the gathering happened the previous night, there's no shot that absolutely nothing would have been mentioned. That's just kind of weird to me. So I think if anything, the gathering would have happened more than one day before these chapters, but at that point, it's really hard to tell. I think that this is plausible enough because enough time could have passed where Tawnypelt knows about what's happening with Leafstar, and it doesn't need to be mentioned because it's not fresh in all the cats' minds for it to be mentioned. That being said, I don't think it could have happened too much more time later because in chapter 21, Hawkwing is mentioned as Hawkwing. Now, this is not that big of a deal because say this happened like 2 days later. Okay, so Leafstar and Hawkwing didn't go to the moon pool yet. They skipped a day, whatever. They were going to do it the night that chapter 21 happens. That works. It also works if Leafstar isn't approved by StarClan to step down and Hawkwing continues to be Hawkwing. Just throwing it out there. This could actually allude to Hawkwing not becoming leader, but that's a whole nother topic. At the end of the day, I feel like it makes the most sense for Leafstar's chapter, The Gathering, to happen to before these Tawnypelt chapters. So all that goes back to, I believe the chronological order of the chapters is this. We have the Moonpaw chapters, then we have the Gathering, then we have the Tawnypelt chapters. And I think at the beginning of book 2, depending on how it's written and where it picks up, I think we will get a better, more clear answer as to when this timeline is. But this is what I think currently. And so yeah, that's my conclusion for the overall timeline of this book. I don't really know how to end this. I think I'll just leave it at that.